Despite the lack of support for ray tracing or even DLSS, the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti is widely considered to be the GOAT, and there's a few reasons for this. First and foremost, it's the $700 US price tag. That has a lot to do with the success of this product, and it really marks the last time we had a flagship gaming graphics card that was reasonably priced. Then couple the fair price with the exceptional longevity, and you have the formula for the best graphics card to ever be released. So how is this thing doing today? Well, before we find out, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Antec and the new Constellation series of ATX cases. The C8 comprises both ARGB and non-ARGB models, with both black and white variants available. The C8 ARGB features a seamless 45-degree beveled glass edge, giving it that popular minimalist design, while also providing a dual chamber for independent cooling. It also comes with a pair of 160mm Tranquil Reverse ARGB PWM fans and a single 140mm fan with a built-in fan control hub that can be synced directly with your motherboard. The top, bottom, and right sides can accommodate a trio of 360mm radiators simultaneously for those who want to ensure ample cooling or just go nuts with their ARGB. Or for those of you who aren't particular fans of RGB effects, there is a non-ARGB version available as well. So, for more information and to check out the rest of Antec's range, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so generally speaking, flagship graphics cards, they do age well, in the sense that several years after release, you're still able to use them. Certainly not as a high-end solution, but they will work. And that's what I found last time I looked at the GTX 1080 Ti back in 2022. At the time, it was roughly on par with the RTX 3060, a GPU that might only cost half as much, but then the 1080 Ti is 4 years older. So, for today's update, I'm going to add the GTX 1080 Ti to our day one review data to see how it compares to the current and previous generation GPUs at 1080p and 1440p in a dozen games. Then also take a look at some live gameplay in a few of the newer titles such as Helldivers 2, Avatar, Horizon Forbidden West, and Counter-Strike 2 for example. For the day one data, I will focus on the 1080p results, but I've also tested at 1440p and we can go over the average data towards the end of the video. And for testing, we're using our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. Okay, let's get into it. Starting with Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, we're testing using the high preset, and while it might just be 1080p, the results are still quite impressive as the GTX 1080 Ti is able to match the RTX 4060 and RX 7600. So that's $300 US GeForce performance in this example, not bad after 7 years. That said, it is less impressive in Spider-Man Remastered, but even so we are using the highest quality preset and we're still looking at over 100 FPS, which is comparable performance to the RTX 2070 and RX 7600. Now I have to admit, I was pretty shocked to find 60 FPS gaming a possibility with the GTX 1080 Ti in Hogwarts Legacy using the ultra quality preset. And as we saw on Cyberpunk 2077, the 1080 Ti is able to match the RTX 4060, and that puts it roughly on par with the RX 6600 and 7600. Also, a comparison I haven't yet drawn is to the 7900 XT, which can be had for $700 US right now, and that was the MSRP of the 1080 Ti. Now, the much newer Radeon GPU is offering a 122% performance uplift in this example, which is a lot, but also it's 5.5 years newer. We see that the GTX 1080 Ti actually managed to deliver a better experience than The Last of Us Part 1 when compared to the RTX 4060, providing smoother frame time performance, largely thanks to that larger 11GB VRAM buffer. That said, with just 52 FPS on average at 1080p, you're likely going to downgrade the quality settings anyway. Starfield was a real struggle for the GTX 1080 Ti, as it rendered just 28 FPS using the ultra quality settings at 1080p. That's comparable performance to the Arc A770, RTX 2070 and RX 6600, so surprisingly quite a bit slower than the Radeon RX 5700 XT and much slower than the RTX 4060. Now the last game we're going to bother looking at the individual results for is Alan Wake 2, and again, the GTX 1080 Ti struggles in this game, though not as much as the 5700 XT. It was 28% slower than the RTX 4060, though even the budget GeForce 40 series GPU was still very weak here, and will require the aid of upscaling. Now, the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti was roughly equivalent to the RX 6600 and RTX 2070 in terms of FPS performance in Hitman 3. But when it comes to power usage, and we are looking at total system power usage here, it's comparable to the 7800 XT, which was 90% faster in this game. Then when compared to the RX 6600, we're looking at just over a 50% increase in total system usage. Then in Spider-Man, performance was equal to the 5700 XT and RX 7600, while slightly faster than the RTX 2070. Here we see that total system power usage averaged 384 watts, which is an almost 40% increase from the RX 7600. So, across the 12 games tested, the GTX 1080 Ti averaged 64 FPS at 1080p, which is similar performance to that of the 5700 XT, A770, RX 6600, and RTX 2070. It was 16% slower than the RTX 4060, so as you'd expect, the GTX 1080 Ti is certainly showing its age. But the fact that it was able to deliver playable performance in almost all of the games tested while using high to ultra quality presets is impressive. Now, the GeForce RTX 4070 Ti was released almost exactly 6 years after the GTX 1080 Ti, but for $800 US, which is roughly in line with inflation for that period. So you could say that the 4070 Ti is equal to the 1080 Ti in terms of pricing. And that means after 6 years, you're looking at about a 140% performance increase, which is certainly worth upgrading for, though it is hardly amazing given the period of time that's taken place here. Oh, and you're only getting an extra gigabyte of VRAM. Then for those of you interested in 1440p, here's a quick look at the 12 game average data where the 1080 Ti rendered 46 FPS on average, again placing it alongside the 5700 XT, RTX 2070 and RX 6600, though the ARC A770 does pull away a little bit here. Here's a quick look at performance in Avatar at 1440p using the medium quality preset. And for this portion of the testing, I'm going to focus on 1440p gaming using more mid-tier quality settings. As you can see, we're looking at around 50 FPS, so not bad given the age of this graphics card. It's certainly playable, and while it might not be optimal, again, it is a 7-year-old graphics card, so that in itself makes the results rather impressive. Now, those who take their Counter-Strike 2 seriously, they tell me that 300 FPS plus is what they desire. And as luck would have it, this is typically what you'll get out of a GTX 1080 Ti at 1440p using medium quality settings, and there's certainly room there to tune the quality settings for probably more competitive type settings. Anyway, I did see a few instances where frame rates dipped into the low 200s, but I think for most trying to play this game on a 7-year-old graphics card, that'll still be acceptable. Helldivers 2 played at around 60 FPS using the GTX 1080 Ti at 1440p with the medium quality settings, and frame time performance was excellent. Certainly enough performance there for some managed democracy, and I could really tell that those alien critters were very appreciative, taking a time out to have a nap after being successfully liberated. You're welcome, little guys. Moving on to Horizon Forbidden West, again at 1440p using the medium preset, we're looking at around 60 FPS, which is certainly enough to play the game, and an impressive result given the age of the 1080 Ti. Then if you want a bit more, you can enable FSR 2.2, and I did so using the quality option, which boosted performance up to around 80 FPS, and visually the game still looked great. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart was tested at, you guessed it, 1440p with the medium quality settings, and here the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti was good enough for between 70 to 80 FPS. Visually, this is a great looking game, even with the medium quality settings, and with reasonably high frame rates, it was very enjoyable. Finally, I took a look at performance in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which is known to be a very well optimized title with impeccable frame time performance. And that's how late my April Fool's joke is. Of course, none of that's true, but even so, the GTX 1080 Ti is able to play Star Wars Jedi Survivor at around 50 FPS using the medium quality settings at 1440p. Then with the help of a bit of upscaling, so FSR quality mode, you can boost frame rates to between 70 to 80 FPS, which was a good experience, all things considered. So there you have it. The GTX 1080 Ti is still kicking along, though I think the end is finally in sight, with current generation entry-level GPUs such as the RTX 4060 offering on average almost 20% greater performance, though admittedly it does have less VRAM. So that's something I hope the next generation of AMD and Nvidia GPUs address. As a side note, it's interesting to look back on data from my GeForce RTX 3080 review, which of course included the GTX 1080 Ti. We see that back then the RTX 2080 was just 6% faster at 1440p, while the RTX 3080 was 58% faster, and although the margin to the 3080 grew to 77% at 4K, the margin to the 2080 actually shrunk to just 3%. Unfortunately though, I wasn't able to include the RTX 2080 in today's video. At some point I do need to limit the number of comparative data points we have, and with just over 20 GPUs that seemed pretty reasonable. Anyway, I did include the RTX 3080, and it was interesting to see that in this updated data, using much newer games, that the GeForce 30 series GPU was on average 101% faster at 1080p and 111% faster at 1440p. Now, the games where the 3080 really smashed the 1080 Ti included Alan Wake 2, no surprises there, Starfield, probably to be expected also, and then Dying Light 2 along with Halo Infinite. Games where the margins were closer to what we saw in our 3080 review at 4K included Hitman 3, so an older game, Hogwarts Legacy, which is probably a bit surprising, A Plague Tale Requiem, again a bit of an older game, Cyberpunk 2077, which is again a bit of an older game, and then Watch Dogs Legion, which is an older game. As for the RTX 2080, which was previously less than 10% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti in our RTX 3080 review, in the list of games tested today, it should end up around 20% faster based on what we see with the RTX 2070. And that's still a pretty weak generational leap, but a big improvement over what we saw in our RTX 3080 review. But this is why the GeForce 20 series was a flop in our opinion. At the time of release, the cost per frame didn't change much, and now, even after many years later, we're still seeing around a 20% performance uplift at the $700 price point, which is pretty bad given that the RTX 3080's offering at least twice as much performance, and sure it is 3.5 years later, but that's still a big performance uplift. It also points to why the GeForce 40 series, like the 20 series, has been very underwhelming, as the RTX 4070 Ti, which accounting for inflation, costs what the GTX 1080 Ti did back in 2017, it's just 140% faster on average, which is just shy of a 20% increase over the RTX 3080. Meanwhile, the newer 4070 Ti Super is just 24% faster than the RTX 3080, or 28% faster at 1440p. So again, pretty disappointing generational improvement there, especially given the Ti Super was released a little over 3 years later. So for those of you who purchased a GTX 1080 Ti back in 2017 or shortly after, would have been best off upgrading in late 2020 to an RTX 3080 for roughly the same money. Sadly though, very few would have been able to do this, as initial demand for the 3080 meant that getting one at the MSRP was near on impossible, and even months after release, still extremely difficult, at which point the most recent cryptocurrency mining boom was in full effect, pretty well wiping out availability of all graphics cards for the next few years. Anyway, that is going to do it for this revisit of the GTX 1080 Ti. I don't suspect there will be too many 1080 Ti revisits in the future. We are nearing the end for this one, sadly, but it's been quite a journey, and this is certainly a legendary GPU. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, subscribe for more content. I probably will do a few more of these GPU revisits, but of course we have a lot of other interesting content coming up as well. We have Floatplane Patreon if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness. It gives you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&As, and behind the scenes content. So yeah, check that out if you're interested, but if not, that is perfectly fine. And above all else, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.